Um, good morning, everybody. First of all, let me start by thanking Africa Investors for putting together this event and this panel. I think these are important issues that we are discussing, the previous panels and our panel and the next panels. We have a good panel today with distinguished panelists. I wonder whether you guys can hear me? Yes, because I'm having some feedback. So, anyway, we have a distinguished panelist, and we have also a very good topic discussing infrastructure as an asset class, pension funds. I think it was fine, sir. Yeah. The topic is certainly quite important to me, but also to my organization, Africa 50. And what I propose to do is that we have a set of questions that we have for the panelists. They go through those questions, and then we will invite questions from the audience. Let me maybe say a few things first from my side about why is it that this topic is important. First of all, Africa 50 is an African developing financial institution. In fact, the most recent DFI that is operating in Africa, but we are quite different from other DFIs operating in Africa because we have a very strong commercial mandate, which was given to us by our shareholders. We are owned so far by 23 African countries, the African Development Bank, and 2 African central banks. The goal is to have all African countries being shareholder of Africa 50, and we're working towards that goal. But an even more important goal is to raise money from institutional investors, some of the pension funds, including, hopefully, some of the folks who are here today. Working with institutional investors is a very important goal. It's in fact a strategic goal for Africa 50, almost as important as the other strategic goal, which is to invest the money that we've already raised and what we're going to be raised into infrastructure assets. So let me also say one other thing why it's really important to figure out a way to mobilize more institutional investors, pension fund money into African infrastructure. Today, actually based on the latest figures which are available, Africa received about $8 billion of private investment in infrastructure in 2015. These are the latest numbers available from the World Bank Group PPIF. And Latin America received about $36 billion, or 36 or 34. I don't know the latest figures. That's more than 4 times more. I think that today, with the $8 billion that Africa receiving in infrastructure, it can be funded with the existing players, more or less. But if we want to get to the kind of numbers that we see in Latin America, and totally it can be done. I know it can be done. In my previous capacity, I was the global head of one of the infrastructure at the World Bank Group, and I was overseeing infrastructure development across the world, the emerging world, certainly. So I saw how things are done in other places, and on the continent we can do what has been done also in other emerging markets. So if we want to move from $8 billion that we're getting today in private capital coming to infrastructure to $36 billion and more, we need to find other sources of financing, and pension fund would have to be part of the solution. So that's why this topic is so important. We won't be able to solve things overnight, but these gatherings are important so we can address those issues. But at some point we have to maybe not stop talking, but we have to actually start doing things. We will continue to talk because Hubert and his team needs to organize these conferences, so it's important for them that we continue. But in parallel, we have to act. So I'm going to ask a couple of additional questions, but maybe also I should turn to the audience for questions. Let me, Elsie, I think your presentation was quite good in the sense that it raises some of the concern, some of the issues that pension funds have, and including a point that Solomon had mentioned earlier, which is that typically pension funds, they don't like to take construction risk. Certainly development risk is almost out of the question, or, except if it's structured in maybe in a portfolio. But certainly construction risk is not good, and they would prefer to come into assets which have been de-risked and which are already operational. And it's up to other stakeholders really to make sure that we have enough of that pool of assets that would be reaching that stage where we can actually attract a bit more pension money into the infrastructure space. Now, Admasu, I'd like to go back to you. We all agree. The numbers that we see today, $8 billion of private investment, are small. And by the way, the $93 billion investment requirement that everybody talks about comes from a World Bank study of 2009. Okay, so a long time back. So today we're talking, in terms of investment requirement in Africa, we're talking much more than that. But the good news is that also the actual investments have increased. So we're still talking about a gap in excess of $50 billion a year, which needs to be funded. Now, if I go to you, Admasu, and you mentioned, and I agree, that there are a number of PPPs, especially in East Africa, certainly in South Africa, we've seen with the refit program a lot of PPPs, but in East Africa as well, some of them. How do we scale up what we are seeing today? Because we know how to do these things, and some countries have done these things. How do we move from doing one IPP or two a year to many, many more of those? Any thoughts on the area, Admasu? Maybe building on one of your success stories. And how would you, I mean, can you see that happening in other countries? I'm sure you can, but how do we get to that?
I think the obvious answer is its leadership at the level of the countries, because I think the whole PPP space relies so heavily on the institutional and regulatory framework. And you know, if you don't define that framework well, and if you don't create processes, create the confidence that's necessary for investors to come in, you have a problem. And I think the reason things have been quite positive in East Africa has to do with very impressive improvements. Whether you look at the IFC Doing Business in Africa report, there's a whole range of indexes that track the behavior of countries in terms of the reform environment, the ease of doing business, all of those institutional aspects. And really PPPs are extremely sensitive to that. It's not about the opportunity, I think it's about that aspect of things. That's the framework in which things happen. I think here in South Africa, there's been some very strong investments made some 15 or so years ago within National Treasury to actually ensure that the whole procurement process around PPPs is streamlined and is reliable, it's stable. The whole question of midstream changes. I think you have that kind of stability here. I think South Africa has done very well in PPPs. Even in this past few years, we've seen so many PPPs come online in the renewable energy space. So it really all boils down to the institutional space. Of course, the underlying issues of stability is also very important. And I think East Africa has also seen good stability in recent years, whether it's Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda coming out of a difficult history, but you know, topping the lists in terms of one of the countries that's doing almost everything right in terms of getting that institutional space going. We all know that Mauritius is a great place to do business. South Africa has been always at the top of the list, but now you have countries like Kenya and Uganda hitting the top performing countries in indexes in recent years. So I think that really gives you a sense of commitment, right? In the end, everything tends to circulate around that. I mean, we ourselves have been very fortunate as TDB because we have reformed very aggressively in recent years to become a PPP in our own right. And the reason that was possible is because the leadership was willing. They passed all the reforms, they changed the constitution, They allowed private investors, institutional investors to come in. They ensured that profitability remained the order of the day, and they ensured that management and skills were rewarded. And so when you get that kind of configuration, you have a lot of the elements of the formula for success. And I should just maybe highlight that we issued a $500 million bond last month in an interest rate rising environment, yet we reduced our cost of funding down about 20% from the issue about 2 years ago. So we've been rewarded for reforming as well.
Fantastic. These are good success stories that we like to hear, and hopefully some of the pension institutional investors are buying your papers, and that's how also they can get to know, the infrastructure market, because you're investing in infrastructure in Africa. I'm told by Barbara that we have limited time left. Let me see whether we have questions from the audience. And I have one for Solomon. Yes, there's a question there. But Solomon, also, while we're getting your questions, I want you to think about how to scale up in Ghana, because Ghana has done a few PPPs, but then things have been stuck. So how do you get it going again? Because we need scale. We cannot do 1 or 2 PPPs a year or 3. So was also a question there. Please, madam, introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name's Fiona Stewart. I'm from the pension team at the World Bank. I had a question on guarantees. You made the differential between the Latin American countries, where the pension funds were very involved because of the monolines. You say that there's plenty of capital here, but we need to de-risk the construction phase. Who can provide those sort of guarantees that could maybe provide the scale to really kick the markets and get going larger?
Okay, that's a good question. I could take it, but Solomon, you could start with the first one on Ghana, and then maybe you can start to address those.
Sure. One of the things that I'm a very frank person. Ghana has an excellent reputation, and it's got a lot of advantages. One of the best advantages it has is that people like to go to Ghana. They enjoy when they go to Ghana, and they would like to invest more. There's been a lot of people that have been trying to invest in Ghana over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, and they didn't manage to succeed. There was difficulties being able to execute and transparency. So if we really want to scale up the PPPs, we've got to be transparent. Investors have got to know that these are the rules of the game, these are the criteria, these are the conditions. This is how procurement works, this is how selection works, and if you follow these rules, then these are the things that the outputs that are going to be expected. That's the first thing. We have to rebuild that credibility of consistency and transparency, and I think the new administration has put that at the centerpiece of a different way that Ghana will be doing business going forward. I think that's very important. The second point I would say very quickly is the government has to follow the things that we have said, and there should be no difference between, the biggest challenge has always been when the minister and the presidents say a very strong, consistent message, but when investors come in and they go 2 or 3 layers down within the ministries, it's a different picture that they get. They get a lot of resistance, a lot of difficulties, and so they end up feeling frustrated. So we have to make sure that all throughout the government, we're saying the same, with the same energy, the same enthusiasm. We've all got the same memo of the importance of attracting private sector and being consistent. That doesn't mean to say that we're going to be easy. We're going to give everything investors want. We have the good of the country at stake. But as long as we make it clear and consistent, I think we'll get a lot more investment coming into Ghana and scaling up the PPPs.
Yeah, look, I agree, and you can see there's consistent message here from Admasou, from Solomon, that really to scale things up, we need to work on the enabling environment, the regulatory framework, to make sure that things are consistent, predictable, certainly. And we will continue to do that in our capacities. But I think the other thing that I like to say is that the private investor don't necessarily want to have everything fixed up, but they need a credible plan and a start of implementation. And there we can have developing financial institutions that can come in and underwrite the transition risk before things are fully bankable on the government side. They can deploy instruments such as the partial risk guarantee to backstop some of the government commitments that have started to be implemented, but they are not yet fully creditworthy. Now, the question on the monoline, which is essentially an instrument which de-risks the project by undertaking, for example, the construction risk. We don't have any monoline, to my knowledge, which is playing on the continent. But certainly, we know that the construction risk has to be addressed to bring in more pension money. Institutions, some institutions would look at ways in which they can address that. But before we get to having monolines that actually would take on 100% a full wrap on construction risk, there are other ways to deal with that. You can have a nice, good EPC contract that will provide some risk mitigation on the construction phase. And you can also build up portfolio of assets that will have assets at different stages of the development process, from the early stage to construction phase, and also operating phase, that institutional investors will look as attractive if they have a portfolio of assets at different stages of the development. So clearly, this is, at least from our standpoint, a development that has to be worked on to find if there will be players that will be willing to underwrite those kinds of risk fully. But even before we have those players, I think there's there will still be a way to attract institutional investors' money on the continent. I wonder if I still have one. No, I don't. But I don't. I was wondering, but I don't. Let me at least thank my panelists for the great job.
You have to have an imported New Yorker to be tough, right?
Okay, thank you, panelists. You did a great job, and thank you, audience. Thank you very much.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.